My Lady, may I call the first witness, please, for today, Professor Sir Michael McBride.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
The evidence I shall give.
The evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the
The
truth.
whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Professor Sir Michael McBride.
Now, I think that you ought to have before you, Sir Michael, 3 statements. The first statement which you made, I think you signed on the 24th of July, 2023. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think that you've signed that statement at page 88. Yes?
I don't have the page in front of me, but I accept that I did.
You probably recall you signed
Yes.
it there. I think it's in front of you now.
I-
And are you content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I'm content that that's a full and accurate statement.
And then I think the next statement that you made is dated the 6th of March 2024, and that's a statement that comes to 366 pages. And I think, again, you signed it on that date. And again, are you content that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief as well?
I am content to affirm that, yes.
And then you signed a third witness statement on the 22nd of March 2024. And again, may I check that you're content that that witness statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I can confirm that.
Sir Brian, in terms of your career, if I may start there, I think that you, first of all, qualified as a medical doctor in 1986. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That you developed a specialisation in research into and the treatment of HIV. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I think that you worked for some time at St Mary's Hospital in London. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And then you returned to Northern Ireland and practiced in that field from 1994 until 2006.
That is correct, yes.
Thereafter, you led and coordinated the response to the H1N1 pandemic in Northern Ireland.
That is correct as well.
And then I think after that point, your career perhaps took a different path in that in 2002, you were appointed the medical director of the Royal Group of Hospitals. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And thereafter, in 2006, you became the Chief Medical Officer for Northern Ireland.
That is correct, yes.
And then from March to August 2009, you were the Permanent Secretary to the Department of Health in Northern Ireland.
That is correct as well, yes.
And also, you were the Chief Executive to the Northern Ireland Health and Social Care. Is that trust or board?
Trust. It was the Health and Social Care Trust, with the Belfast Trust.
All right. And is that an arm's length body of the Department of Health?
It is a provider organisation delivering health and social care, which is an arm's length body from the department.
And then I think that from November 2014 to February 2017, you were the Chief Executive, is that of the Belfast Health and Social Care Trust?
Yes.
And then I think in July 2021, you were made an Honorary Professor of Practice at Queen's University in Belfast, correct?
That is correct.
All right. I just want to come back and understand, if I may, a bit more about your role as the Chief Medical Officer to Northern Ireland and how it compares to the UK CMO, Professor Sir Chris Whitty. In terms of his role, first of all, he acts as an advisor to the UK government, doesn't he, as opposed to just the Department of Health and Social Care in the United Kingdom?
That is correct, yes.
And I think that it's also right that his position is an independent position at permanent secretary level. Is that your understanding?
That is correct. That is my understanding, yes.
And I think it's right that by contrast, your position is not an independent one within the government in Northern Ireland. Is that correct?
There are the two aspects to that. In terms of my policy responsibilities, which is where it differs, I am not independent in terms of policy responsibility. I'm accountable for that to the Perm Sec in the department. In relation to my professional advisory role, it would be akin to that of Professor Whitty in providing independent advice. My advice as Chief Medical Officer is directly to the Minister, to the Perm Sec. So it is independent and independent of, shall we say, it's given freely without an unfettered in terms of a professional advice. So it's similar to the situation with Professor Chris Whitty in that respect.
Can I see if I can understand that a
Yes,
bit
sure.
more? Because in fact, you are and you were at the time of the pandemic a member of the senior management team
Sure.
within the Department of Health in Northern Ireland. So in terms of your functional independence, you're not functionally independent of the Department of Health, are you?
No, in terms of that, I don't have a separate office per se, and I am part of the managerial arrangements within the department. So I'm a member of the senior management team, which in the department is referred to as the top management group. I am a member of the departmental board, but separately I also have a professional advisory role and responsibilities, and within my group I have also the Chief Dental Officer, Chief Pharmaceutical Officer, the Chief Environmental Health Officer, and we provide independent professional advice, not just to the department, but also we provide independent professional advice with the agreement of the Minister to other departments when that's requested. So there is a separation, and that when I'm providing professional advice, I'm very clear, and others are very clear, I'm providing independent professional advice.
It might be thought very simply that you can't provide independent advice to a department or organisation that you are part and parcel of.
I can understand that perception. I can assure you that over the years I've not, as I said earlier, I've not felt that in any way my professional advice has been compromised or has in any way filtered, and I give my advice, my professional advice, freely and directly to the Minister. But I understand the perception and that conflation of policy responsibility and accountability, and then separately the professional rules and responsibility. And I'm conscious it almost seems like I'm trying to wear two hats, both at the same time. But I'm very clear in my mind. The department is very clear. And when I'm giving professional advice, I'm giving independent professional advice.
I want to examine that, if I may, in a little bit more detail, and,
Sure.
and look perhaps in a bit more detail at your role and the advice that you give. But just again, trying to understand where you fit in terms of the management structure. To whom were you accountable within that structure?
I'm accountable to the Permanent Secretary in the department. I'm also ultimately accountable to the Minister in the department, whoever that Minister might be at a particular point in time.
And in terms of who you had management responsibility for within that structure, who reported to you, or who were you the line manager of?
In terms of policy rules and responsibilities, those have evolved and changed, and they continually change within the department. But at the time of the relevant to the inquiry, I had policy responsibility for all aspects of public health, so that would have included health protection, health improvement. I also had policy responsibility for quality and safety and policy. So as that pertained to, for instance, serious adverse incidents, investigation processes and policy, complaints policy. I also had policy responsibility for research within health and social care, and was supported very ably by the Chief Scientific Advisor who you heard from recently. So those would be the main areas of policy responsibility. Now, I also had a number of other roles within that, including sponsorship responsibilities on behalf of the department, which I exercised in relation to the Public Health Agency, which is the public health.
I'm going to ask
Sure.
you to slow down slightly,
Okay.
just because you're speaking quite quickly. So I think what you've delineated your responsibilities in terms of the areas that you had direct oversight of within the Department of Health, the issues or the the areas that you've just gone through, and I think you're separately then saying that you had sponsorship responsibility,
Yes.
and I think that was for the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland and the RQIA as well. Is
That's
that
correct.
correct? And I think we'll touch upon the RQIA in due course, but that's the body that has oversight of, I think, or is the regulator of health and social care services in Northern Ireland, correct?
Correct.
And also exercises those functions in respect of care homes and nursing homes as well.
That's one aspect of the work, but yes.
We'll come back to that. I just want to focus and continue to focus on your role within the Department of Health. Can you help me as to whether or not the advice that you provided to the department during the pandemic, or indeed generally, whether that advice is shared with the Minister and the Permanent Secretary, or cleared by the Department of Health or the Minister before it is shared with the Executive Office?
As I say, my role is not a cross-government role, and that's where it differs from, you mentioned Professor Sir Chris Whitty. It is a role within the department. The advice that I be providing is health advice. Normally, what happens within Northern Ireland government is that a minister would write to another minister, another department, and seek input from officials within their department. So I would provide my advice. It's not cleared by the minister, but the minister would be aware that I would be providing advice to another department. And as I say, that advice is provided and it's not filtered or cleared as such, but in that it is health advice, the minister would have an awareness that I was providing that advice.
All right, I'll come back and look at that again in a bit. We'll go to some specific documents and perhaps examine that. When Sir Chris Whitty gave evidence to the inquiry, he referred to the fact that his independence was a prized aspect of his role and gave evidence about the Office of the Chief Medical Officer in the UK and this characteristic of its independence going back to the 1860s. Was it not regarded as perhaps anachronistic in Northern Ireland that the CMO should both not just be within the Department of Health, but actually an intrinsic part of the management of that department as well?
I mean, that's the structure that I was appointed into. It wasn't a structure of my design. And I think that it probably also relates to the relative size of Northern Ireland. We often have individuals covering multiple roles because essentially we are a very, very small department, and we don't have the numbers of individuals to separately cover a range of issues. And I mean, that became a material issue in terms of resilience during the pandemic response itself.
But in terms of the suggestion, I think, that you're making that you could effectively decouple your role into a non-independent one and an independent one, is that not obviously problematic in a number of respects?
I mean, I can see from the outside looking in, I absolutely accept the point that you're making. From myself, working in the role over many years, that was a distinction that I was very clear in my own mind in terms of my policy responsibilities and lead role, and my responsibilities, my professional responsibilities as Chief Medical Officer. I mean, if I could expand to make your point, there are some inconsistencies with that, for instance. So if I take one of my areas of policy responsibility, which is health improvement, addressing health inequalities, I have passionately spoken about health improvement and health inequalities over many, many years, and the disparities that there are in terms of health outcomes, healthy life expectancy, depending on where people live. You know, the circumstances in which they are born, they live, they grow up, and they're educated. But at the same time, the policy responsibility for health improvement sits in my group, of which I am the head. So, I mean, I think that's just illustrates, the point that you're making. However, I was always clear in my own mind when I said we need to do more professionally to address health inequalities, to improve people's life chances. I spoke freely and again unfettered when I was speaking professionally about the need to do more, not just within health, but to do more across government collectively to deliver improvements in health and well-being of the population and to address health inequalities.
I'm just going to look at this, if I may, through the lens of the pandemic.
Sure.
And why it might be regarded as potentially problematic that you were a part of the Department of Health. And it may be very obvious, but I mean, obviously there's the objective perception perhaps on the part of others, and perhaps most importantly on the part of other ministers, that they would regard you as speaking for the department as opposed to giving them independent advice. Do you agree that that's something that was potentially problematic and indeed may have become problematic during the course of the pandemic? So that's two questions.
I can accept that there is a perception. I mean, two of the ministers I previously served as health ministers who were part of the executive, so they would have known, you know, the Deputy First Minister would have known that clear separation. The then Minister for DERA was also a previous health minister. I think that but obviously ministers will be better able to speak to this. My understanding throughout the pandemic was they regarded the advice that I and the Chief Scientific Advisor were providing was provided independently. And I say that, I mean, I can understand that when perhaps some of the more challenging periods, that there may have been a perception that somehow or other that there was a conflict in the role, but certainly that was never a conflict that I mean, I gave advice, professional advice. Obviously, I had a close working relationship with whoever was the health minister, but equally I had good relationships with other executive ministers who I would have known over many years. So my sense, but as I say, others will be better able to comment, was that the independence of the advice that myself and the Chief Scientific Advisor was providing was both understood and was respected.
I think that those might be different things, though, and I mean, we
Sure.
may hear more evidence about this from the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, but I think we've maybe had a flavour of it from some other witnesses, and I'm thinking of Sir Peter Weir, who gave evidence about the power wielded by the Department of Health and appeared to encompass you and the CSA, the Chief Scientific Advisor, within that sort of block. Is that something that you recognise or perceived at the time?
No. I mean, the power and authority is vested in ministers. Ministers are the decision makers. They determine policy, which is right and appropriate. My role and the role of the Chief Scientific Advisor was to provide advice. We provided that advice, but the medical and scientific advice was only but one aspect of the many other factors that ministers needed to consider and the executive needed to consider before arriving at a decision. I mean, I was very clear at every stage that ultimately the decisions were decisions for ministers, and I have to say I'm somewhat surprised if there was any perception to the contrary.
All right. Well, we'll come to look at that, but again, just focusing on the reasons why it might potentially be problematic that you were not independent of the Department of Health. isn't it extremely difficult and human that you would be able to, as it were, decouple your professional advice from the operational concerns that the Department of Health had and would have during a pandemic? So, for example, that the sorts of operational concerns about which we've seen a great deal of evidence would inexorably colour the advice that you were going to give to ministers.
I think that proximity and awareness of some of the operational issues, some of the consequences of the pandemic across health and social care, the pressures on the health service, the outbreaks in care homes. I think that was an advantage in terms of in shaping and informing the advice. I don't see that disadvantageous. I think it ensured, as a very small system, we have very close lines of communication, and therefore there's a high level of awareness of what the pressures in the system are. And I think that was of benefit in informing the advice that I was providing and its relevance. I don't see that as a disadvantage at all.
Moving on, in terms of this inquiry and the work that was done for this inquiry on the part of the Department of Health, obviously you've provided your statements and have put a huge amount of work into providing the inquiry with those. But did you also have a role in the preparation of the departmental corporate witness statement?
Only insofar as it related to my areas of policy responsibility, not in matters of opinion or views. So take an example where it came to input on departmental policy in relation to health inequalities. Yes, I would have provided input into that. But the corporate statement is a corporate statement and covers many, many other policy areas across the department for which I didn't have policy responsibility, and covers the responsibilities of not just myself but other professional colleagues within the department.
I think, again, I just want to be clear about this. I think the answer is yes, then, that you have contributed to and informed the corporate statement on behalf of...
Well, I think the answer is a qualified yes. It's qualified to the extent that where it was relevant and appropriate. I mean, was I signing off and clearing the corporate statement? No, I wasn't. I was providing input, giving my policy responsibility in the same way that other professional and policy colleagues would have provided input to the corporate statement. I wasn't holding the pen on the corporate statement.
All right. And did you have a role in the preparation in the same way in any of the other witness statements that were provided to the inquiry on behalf of the Department of Health? So, for example, Mr. Pengelly.
No, I didn't provide any input at all into Mr. Pengelly's statement.
So was it just the corporate witness statement then?
Corporate witness statement in relation to my policy areas of responsibility.
So I think in terms of the Department of Health response to this inquiry and your response, that there isn't a clear line either. That distinction is somewhat blurred in that regard.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I've clarified the relevance of the input that I provided. Now, I would add that the input was provided by my team. So it would have been policy colleagues within health protection, policy colleagues within health improvement, policy colleagues within the vaccination programme. Now, they report to me, but they were doing the detail input. I just wouldn't have the capacity to provide the input. But I mean, they do report to me, and I think that I've been clear that there was appropriate input, I would suggest, in relation to those areas for which I ultimately had policy responsibility.
I'm going to move on, if I may, and deal with a different topic. which is the absence of the chief scientific advisor. And perhaps if I start with an email, please, if I could bring this document up on screen. It's INQ 000 047 559. And I think if we could go to page 4 of this document, please. And I think it's the document of the 25th of January 2020. Sir Michael, we can see that it's from you, and I think it's sent to the UK CMO group. Is that correct?
Yes, I can confirm that's correct, yes.
And I think we've seen this, or we've certainly referred to this email before, but at the final paragraph, you say a massive thank you to Chris. I think that's obviously Sir Chris Whitty, Jonathan, I think it's Professor Van Tam, DHSC and PHE colleagues, as ever you will be doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us and providing much appreciated expert advice. Thank you, that can come down. Does that email capture the relationship between Northern Ireland or you and Professor Sir Chris Whitty at the start of the pandemic, or was that generally the relationship that the United Kingdom experts, as it were, would be doing the heavy lifting for Northern Ireland?
I think the latter. I mean, I can expand on that if it's helpful. What I was referring to there was the fact that the Northern Ireland does not have an equivalent of SAGE. I mean, it wouldn't be technically or scientifically feasible for us to replicate the expertise within SAGE, nor would it be operationally necessary. So as part of the UK, we are critically dependent and plug into SAGE, its subgroups, including nerve tag for expert professional advice. And as I say, we would not be able to replicate that in Northern Ireland. And I think the same would apply to the other jurisdictions to a greater or lesser extent. Northern Ireland is relatively small, and to ensure that we have the best available scientific advice, it's important that we make best use of those established networks.
Although nonetheless, you did have a chief scientific advisor, but the inquiry understands he wasn't called on at all at the outset of the pandemic until he came back. I should be clear about this. He went on leave in the middle of February, but he wasn't called upon to be part of the response in Northern Ireland at all. And at that point,
I wouldn't be inclined to read too much into that, and maybe I could explain the context. As the situation was evolving, as all new pathogens as they emerge, the initial response is a public health response. So on an ongoing basis, there's active surveillance globally for the emergence of anything that potentially could become a threat to human health. That arrangement, UK is plugged into European arrangements and WHO arrangements. At this stage, this was a watching brief on a new and emerging pathogen. The primary focus was the public health focus on it. So in England, that was being coordinated by what was then Public Health England, in liaison with the public health bodies in each of the jurisdictions in the UK. What subsequently evolved then was the stand-up, what we refer to as an incident management team. So this is basically the public health organisations and professionals watching, seeing the picture as it emerges, determining what, if any, steps need to be taken. So it was being managed initially in the very early days through that lens, and it was only then, once this became recognised as a potentially greater threat, that we as chief medical officers became involved. and then only later again when the science started to emerge that, because those very early days we knew very, very little about this virus. There was very little scientific data available to us. So incrementally, science and the sort of public health response became very much integral, because understanding the science was key to understanding the virus, which was key to the public health response.
And when you say, sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you, when you say that in the early days, what period are you talking about?
It's hard now to cast one's mind back, but certainly my recollection is that, I first received emails about this novel pathogen somewhere either late December or early January. I recall there was a press statement went out from Public Health England, I think around maybe the start of the second week in January, about travellers to China in relation to this novel virus, and also in relation to avian influenza at that time, of which there was also concern. So it's probably in that initial period around early January, in the first couple of weeks in January, from recollection.
Yes, but by the 24th of January, the UK government had convened Cobra.
Yeah.
So, and at that stage, obviously, that was gathering together a much broader spectrum of people from across government,
Indeed.
including the chief scientific advisor to the government. So why at that stage, did that not prompt the thought we could do with having people in Northern Ireland involved, and more people than me involved in this in Northern Ireland in terms of that
Well, just to answer your question,
advisory role?
Just to answer your question, it wasn't just me. I was very ably supported by, at that time, 2 deputy chief medical officers, both of whom were publicly health trained, both of whom were trained in clinical epidemiology. I also had 2 senior medical officers who similarly were public health consultants and were trained in clinical epidemiology and had experience in managing a significant number of outbreaks of various infections over the years. So it wasn't that there was an absence of scientific input or advice to me. It was basically, at those early days, it was primarily from a public health perspective, because again, what we were seeking to ascertain at that time was what the public health implications of this might be. Now, I think that I would say that on reflection, and I genuinely now don't recall whether I did have conversations with the chief scientific advisor at that time, but on reflection, if I didn't, it does now seem a bit of a gap. I would agree. I didn't feel it was a gap at that time. I felt significantly comfortable in the information that I was being provided with, my ability to interpret that information, and the support that I was receiving from my team in interpreting that information. I think it also goes to the point, one of the points I made earlier, which is that the one of resilience, the chief scientific advisor role in the department is a part-time role, and he works 3 times a week in the department, but has other responsibilities. And you alluded to, and maybe I'm getting ahead of the question, but he was absent then for a period, and his absence was both unpredictable and sadly unavoidable at that time. So I certainly welcomed his return, and certainly that was a great source of scientific advice and support in terms of the advice that I was providing, and over the course of the next couple of years.
But just focusing on that, we've already heard evidence from him that there was no modelling capacity until he returned and you asked him to undertake that work, and that there was no independent advisory body to Northern Ireland and to you in order to inform the advice to the Health Minister until, I think it was the 27th of April that met for the first time. And sorry, just in terms of the question then, it might seem surprising that what might be thought as fairly fundamental parts of the response to the pandemic were contingent upon an individual coming back from leave, and that there wasn't a system response, but rather an individual response.
I'm not sure that's a fair characterisation, if I might say so. I mean, I think that in relation to the scientific advice, we were receiving, from the 24th of January, we had, and I think you showed it in that email chain, we had regular 4 UK CMO meetings from the 24th of January, and they were specifically on the emerging threat of COVID. Those meetings were happening 3 times a week in 2020, and indeed, over the period of this inquiry, there were 274 of such meetings. So there was regular engagement, and we were receiving and discussing all of the relevant science and public health, and considering the public health implications on an ongoing basis. In terms of modelling, in those early days, the problem was absence of hard data to do specific modelling. And as I no doubt we will maybe come on to later, what we were essentially using was reasonable worst case scenario planning from seasonal flu, and using that to project the potential impact for planning purposes and for modelling purposes in terms of at a UK level. I mean, in those early days, we didn't even have, and SAGE did not, SAGE and SPI-M, which was the modelling subgroup of SAGE, was not able to do regional specific modelling for Scotland or Northern Ireland. It was actually doing UK-wide modelling.
Okay, so can I
so there's an important point, if I may, on the modelling, because we had no cases in Northern Ireland. So we had no hard data to do any Northern Ireland specific modelling at that time. Now, the chief scientific advisor returned at exactly the right time when we did have local data, and therefore we could do local modelling. So I think that's a crucially important point. And the other point I would make is there was modelling capacity within the PHA, but it wasn't to the sufficient extent that we could scale it up quickly enough, particularly given the other demands that were emerging on the Public Health Agency.
Yeah, I will come back and touch upon the demands on the Public Health Agency, but I wanted to focus on the structures in Northern Ireland,
Okay.
If I may, just for a moment, and coming back to my question, which was whether or not the response was driven by individuals rather than by a system response. And I think it's right. Northern Ireland didn't have any membership of SAGE at that point.
That's correct.
It didn't have any membership of SAGE until the Chief Scientific Advisor came back. Is that correct? I think he was the person who became a member.
I mean, if I could clarify, and I'm conscious we didn't get to answer the second part of your first series of questions was about the scientific and advisory group in Northern Ireland, so maybe we'll come back to that. We did have observer status on SAGE, as did other jurisdictions. You're absolutely correct. We didn't have membership. I do think that was a disadvantage in the early days of the pandemic, because it is one thing being present and listening to the discussion and the debate. It's quite another thing interjecting and contributing to that debate. So I think that was a disadvantage in the early days, and certainly on the chief scientific advisor's return, that we did have a discussion, and we agreed that full membership of SAGE was crucially important, and that was agreed to by the SAGE Secretariat. I think that was certainly an advantage and remained so throughout the pandemic.
But in terms even of observing what was happening at Sage. I think it's right that there was no Northern Ireland observer, or that no one's certainly been able to confirm that anyone observed the first 5 meetings. Is that right?
Well, we weren't invited to the first 5 meetings, which is a different point again.
Yes,
and
quite
maybe
so.
want to return to that. We were only invited we received invitations from the 7th of February, which was after the 5th meeting of SAGE. Now, I would qualify that again by saying that as the 4 UK CMOs, we had been meeting from the 24th of January, so there wasn't any sense that what was emerging in terms of the concerns or the consensus or recommendations from SAGE wasn't being relayed by Professor Chris Whitty to the other 4 CMOs. However, I think it is correct, but that we were not hearing that discussion and that debate in real time.
And I think that, and I want to be fair about this, because I think the Department of Health has confirmed that a trainee medical advisor did observe some of the SAGE meetings, and you did as well, but not all of them.
Well, I think if I could bring you back to, and I think it's now impossible for me to convey fully the pace, the momentum, the multiple demands, the competing demands and diary pressures that there were. And in a department the size of the health department in Northern Ireland, those were extreme, and particularly in that early period. And certainly I can confirm, and I think we have confirmed with the inquiry, that in the period in February through to March and the Chief Scientific Advisor's return, I personally attended 8 of the 14 SAGE meetings, and Northern Ireland was represented as observer on 10 of the 14, and it may have well have been more. It's only our records are not complete, and we cannot confirm with certainty. But what we have confirmed is those meetings there where we can assure you that there was someone in attendance.
But does it come back to the point, Sir Michael, in terms of it being very heavily dependent on you as an individual, obviously under enormous strain at this point in time? And is there not a proper point about your ability as one individual to synthesize a very considerable body of expert advice and opinion that was being generated at that time?
Well, as I've said earlier, it wasn't just me. I was very ably supported by 2 deputy chief medical officers who were experts in this area, and 2 senior medical officers who were both public health consultants who were also expert in this area. I think there is a wider point which I mentioned earlier, which is we are a very, very small professional team within the department. I think at the time there were 6 of us, myself and 2 deputies and a number of senior medical officers. And some of those were not whole-time, although became so because everyone was absolutely committed from the outset to managing the emerging situation. So I think in terms of, and I've covered this in my witness statements, both of them, the learning point for me is certainly the resilience within my office, within my team. And I think that in all small jurisdictions, one of the problems is you have too many single critical points of failure potentially. And I think that is something that needs to be considered in terms of learning for the future.
All right. I'm going to move on because I want to ask you about some of the challenges that Northern Ireland faced at that time, particularly as regards its health services. And I wanted to begin with a point that you've made in your witness statement. I don't think I need to take you to it because I think it's something that you're very familiar with. But just starting with the profile of health in Northern Ireland, I think that your opinion is that, broadly speaking, the population of Northern Ireland compares to most other parts of the United Kingdom, save for, and I'll come back to this, the prevalence of mental ill health. And I think it's also right that in terms of health inequalities in Northern Ireland, perhaps the most significant one, but please say if I'm putting this too broadly, relates essentially to poverty. Is that an accurate way of putting it, or social disadvantage?
I think it's the latter. I think it's broader based. A sort of straightforward way of describing it is the circumstances in which people are born, they live, they grow up, they work, they age, and it's all of those economic, societal, environmental factors, and also the underpinning behavioural factors which contribute to the stark differences in life expectancy, healthy life expectancy, which frankly are not unique to Northern Ireland, sadly,
Yes.
but remain stubbornly difficult to address.
And I think, again, just for the purposes of comparison to the other parts of the United Kingdom, is that inequality in Northern Ireland, again, broadly similar to other parts of the United Kingdom?
It is, and I mean, I've covered this, and I don't know if you wish me to go into any further detail on it, but it is broadly similar. And I think, and depending the measurement that you take, but if you look at life expectancy, generally, women live longer than men in Northern Ireland. We generally compare more favourably to Wales and Scotland, less favourably to England in terms of life expectancy, although we have seen a stalling and fall in life expectancy across all the four nations. That has been greater in England than here. So the gap between ourselves and England has somewhat narrowed over the last 4 years.
All right. And just returning then to the particular prevalence of mental ill health in Northern Ireland, and that being a distinguishing feature perhaps from the rest of the United Kingdom. I think that relates to the fact that there are many more people diagnosed with a mental health condition in Northern Ireland. Is that correct, as compared to other parts of the UK?
Yes, and I think I did reference some research that had been carried out by Professor Siobhan O'Neill and Professor Nicola Rooney in relation to that differential and why that might be. And amongst their conclusions was that in a society coming out of conflict, which sadly we were a society that was in conflict for many, many years, that the root cause of much of that was that conflict. And again, we've had research from Queen's University, which looking at the prescription of antidepressants, and those individuals who live in interface areas close to so-called peace walls, we see a higher rate of prescription of antidepressants. So there is no doubt that there has been an enduring and lasting consequence of what we euphemistically refer to as the Troubles in Northern Ireland.
All right. I'll come back, because obviously that might be something that's relevant in terms of the considerations that needed to be taken into account in terms of the consequences of some of the restrictions. So that's why I wanted to ask you about that before moving on then to some of the other perhaps distinct challenges that Northern Ireland faced. And specifically, I wanted to ask you your opinion about the absence of ministers between 2017 and 2020 and the extent to which that absence or void of ministerial decision-making in that period affected health services in Northern Ireland in a way that conditioned the response to the pandemic specifically.
Yes, I've thought about this a lot in formulating my response in my statement, and I have a view that is not a professional or technical view, so therefore I'm somewhat hesitant to share it. Others may have different views, and those views may be much more valid than mine. I think that it is absolutely preferable to have a government in Northern Ireland and to have ministers in place. And I think we were fortunate during the pandemic that we did have ministers in place and a government in place. And I've also said so in my statement. I think that that period between 2017 for the 3 years until 3 weeks before the pandemic started was a difficult period. Certainly from a departmental perspective and from my role as Chief Medical Officer, we were not able to advance significant policy decisions or take forward legislation underpinning those policy decisions. That was problematic. And I know some of this was covered by the then Perm Sec in his evidence, so I'll not go over that ground again in terms of the limitations and constraints under which permanent secretaries operated. I think that, as I've said in my statement, the health system in Northern Ireland was long overdue for structural change and reform. We'd had a succession of reports and reviews, and it wasn't the absence of reports and reviews or future policy determination, but it was one of implementation. Because obviously major restructuring requires ministers to agree to those major changes, and we didn't have ministers to agree to those major changes. Now, that said, we were fortunate in that we had, and we may come on to this, the publication of the Bengoa report, Systems Not Structures, in the October of 2016. So that gave us a roadmap or a blueprint of a future direction of travel for how health and social care in Northern Ireland might be transformed. So during that period, in the absence of ministers, there was a lot of preparatory work. There was a lot of public engagement. And that preparatory work and public engagement would have needed to occur whether ministers were in post or ministers were not on post. And indeed, many of those new models that we were designing, we used to good effect during the pandemic to make sure that we minimised the impact from the downturn in routine services that we had. But we could not make decisions about the end point and final decisions around what that new structure would look like and how those services would be redesigned. Now, that was one half of the problem. The other half of the problem was the budgetary situation, which is well out with my remit, but as you say, I was a Perm Sec at a point in time as well, so maybe I have some insight into that. Northern Ireland has been a situation where we've had, and the Minister I think sums this up quite well in his statement, a hand-to-mouth existence, where we had 1 year budget cycles as opposed to a 3 or 5 year budget. And therefore, we were dependent on what's referred to as in-year monitoring returns. So this is, slippage in spend in other departments, which would go back to the centre and then would be given out to other departments. And we benefited from that. But you can't plan strategically. You can't employ staff on a recurrent basis on non-recurrent money. So we had that, if I might say, double hit of not being able to implement the change and actually not having the budgetary certainty either, which meant that many decisions were short-term decisions as opposed to longer-term strategic decisions which only ministers can make.
But just coming back to the focus of Module 2C and whether or not the difficulties that health services faced as at January 2020 and whether they conditioned the response or created strictures in terms of the response. What's your opinion on that specifically?
Yeah, I think as the chair will note, I was asked this question in Module 1, and my view was that the health system in Northern Ireland was less resilient at the start of this pandemic than it was in 2009, which with the H1N1 pandemic, which by comparison was it did not have anywhere near the same impact. So we headed into this pandemic with a less resilient health and social care system, budgetary uncertainty, significant workforce challenges and vacancies, a system that was long overdue for change. A decision had been made in 2015 to close the Health and Social Care Board, which was one of the major commissioning bodies of services. But obviously, in the absence of ministers, that decision could not be enacted until April 22. So you had staff within a really important key body uncertain of their future, and we lost some very experienced staff. And similarly within the Public Health Agency, because of the voluntary exit scheme from 2014, and I know other witnesses have referred to the impact that had on the civil service, we also were losing experienced staff from the Public Health Agency, and also, I might say, the department. So as we headed into this pandemic, I certainly can, my assessment would be that we were not in as good a place as we were in 2009.
All right, I'll come back to perhaps some of those concerns fed into the advice that was given, but I think we can proceed on the basis then that pandemic to one side, health services in general were in quite a precarious position. I'm going to move on to something quite different and ask you then about Northern Ireland's pandemic flu plan. And I think, was that something that you had corporate responsibility for within the Department of Health as part of?
The department and ultimately the PERMSEC in the department has corporate responsibility. I had policy responsibility. So the corporate responsibility is for the health element of it. Now, we need to also be aware that the pandemic flu policy transcends many parts of government, and I think this is something which came up, yesterday in terms of who holds the ring when there's a pandemic, because pandemics, as we can see from the response to this pandemic, cut across the policy responsibility of many departments. But to answer your question, I had policy responsibility for it, supported by my team, but it was a corporate departmental responsibility, and equally there were responsibilities under CCG and I, Civil Contingencies Group, for other departments in relation to elements of that, for instance, the Department of Justice in relation to any excess deaths, and the Executive Office in terms of cross-sectoral resilience in actually other areas outside of health. So, health does the health bit.
Yes.
Other departments need to do the other bits.
I think you're probably coming on to a fundamental issue about the nexus between the Department of Health and other departments as part of the response. And I'm going to move on to deal with that and with the contingency arrangements. I just wanted to deal with the flu plan and what happened in respect of that. I think that what you say in your statement, and this is your second statement at paragraph 155, I don't think we need to go to it. The extant position at the end of January 2020 was that existing pandemic flu plans could have been adapted to address a novel pathogen other than influenza. In actual fact, the extant pandemic influenza plan in respect of specific elements of the response was not of material benefit, as it was clearly written following the experience of the H5N1 pandemic, and not for a pandemic as severe as Covid-19, with the extensive measures and interventions required, including the lockdown and the scale-up in diagnostic testing and contact tracing. So I just wanted to examine and understand whether or not in January those plans were revisited then in light of the information that was coming to light about the development of the pandemic.
We certainly were using elements of those plans and the arrangements that fell out from those plans. So in terms of the assessment of what the impact would be, we were up until 27th of February, when SAGE changed its recommendations in relation to reasonable worst case scenario, when it had some hard data on the virus, and then that was accepted by the Cabinet Office. We were using the reasonable worst case scenario for pandemic flu to inform our planning and preparation. Now, that was useful, and indeed, when this was declared a public health emergency of international concern by the WHO on the 30th of December, as 4 UK CMOs, we said, prepare for all
30th of January, I think.
Sorry, did I not say that?
You said December.
Oh, sorry, apologies. 30th of January. We said use the reasonable worst case scenario for pandemic flu without a vaccine as a basis for planning and preparation, which is what we did. Now, so that initial modelling was helpful in terms of pointing to the potential impact of what was beginning to emerge or potentially emerge. So that was useful. But in any scenario, including the reasonable worst case scenario for pandemic flu, which we were then using, or subsequently the reasonable worst case scenario, which was more specific to COVID, the health service would not have been able to cope. I think that what was extremely helpful, and I think I would hope the inquiry, when it reflects on these arrangements, in terms of how we are better prepared in the future, considers the role of the emergency planning arrangements that we have in place, because those are agnostic. It doesn't really matter what the pathogen is. The arrangements in terms of the gold, the silver and the bronze arrangement served us very well in the initial response in terms of the health department responding to the pandemic. And all of that was informed by and developed from our exercises and training in terms of how we would respond to a pandemic flu. And I would say that those structures served us well. Now, we did need to modify them because they weren't designed for what turned out to be a long-term response and almost, to the pandemic. We had never used them to that extent before, and the 2009 pandemic was the last occasion that they had been used. Where the pandemic flu plans were less helpful, and I think this is an important learning point if I could finish on that, where they were less helpful was that they had not anticipated or planned for the sort of pandemic that we had in 1918. Or indeed in 58 or 67, which were more severe pandemics. And I think that even if you look back on those pandemics, whilst there were some limited NPIs used during 1918, we had never before, ever, used NPIs to the extent that we used in this pandemic or had to use in this pandemic. We had similarly never tested to the extent that we had tested. We were ultimately were testing in this pandemic, and we had never before performed contact tracing at the scale that we were contact tracing. It had never been envisaged, and therein is the important learning point. It had never been envisaged. And I think the point I want to come back to and finally close on, that I was present during the 2009 pandemic. I was involved in the development of the 2011-2000, was published here in 2013 pandemic plan. And we looked, as you always do, to your last experience of the last pandemic. And that's a mistake. Because looking back, and it's important to look back to establish the learning about what you might do different, the next pandemic will not be the same. And I think from the inquiry's perspective, it's about what are the, if I might respectfully suggest, is what are the core elements of a response to any pandemic which are generic. What are the core elements of any response that you need to be able to scale at pace and with agility? And then to think around a range of scenarios of potential new pathogens which may lead to a pandemic, and then begin to think what are the specific elements that we might need to inform a response to those range of pathogens. So, for instance, with climate change, are we prepared for a vector-borne pandemic? Now, sorry, I shouldn't be asking you the question, but I think those are the sort of questions that we need to be asking in our planning and preparation. And I think that is just a really vitally important point that I hope the inquiry will be able to make some recommendations on.
All right. Well, I just want to focus, if I may, on what actually happened in response to the pandemic in Northern Ireland in these early stages in 2020. And I was asking you about the pandemic flu plan, because when he gave evidence to Module 2 of the inquiry, Professor Sir Chris Whitty said that at around the time when evidence was accumulating about how serious and severe the pandemic might be, he said that it was pretty clear to him that the pandemic flu plan in the UK wasn't going to give us any particular help, frankly, is what he said. And he went on to say, so my view was we didn't have a plan that was going to be useful from a prevention or management point of view. It had a large number of useful components within it. There was nothing helpful there. But the idea there was a respiratory pandemic plan for the kind of pandemic this was going to be, if that was going to be the problem that we could just take off the shelf and follow the playbook, was optimistic at best. And I think the question for you is whether or not you similarly approached the pandemic flu plans in Northern Ireland on the basis that they weren't actually going to be very much help at all.
I didn't take down the pandemic flu plan and look at it and say this is a playbook for how we respond to this pandemic. No. So to that extent, my comments in my statement concur with those of Professor Sir Chris Whitty.
Forgive me, I didn't mean to cut across you. I think he was making a different point. He wasn't saying that it was treated as a playbook. He was saying that he realised that there wasn't a plan that was particularly useful, that realisation crystallised. Yeah. And I'm asking you if similarly you had that realisation.
Yeah, I'm not certain. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're saying the same thing.
Okay.
The pandemic flu plan, to my mind, as I've said, was not of huge use. There were elements, there were building blocks within it, and I've given the example of the emergency response arrangements. I've given the example of the reasonable worst case scenario planning, how we used that. But in more general terms, given the severity of this pandemic, it was not of huge use. So I would absolutely agree with it. And again, just coming back to the final point, and the reference to there wasn't a plan I could take off a shelf. There will never be a plan you can take off a shelf because the next pandemic will be something that we were not expecting. That is the nature of pandemics. And I think, just to reiterate the point that I've just made, and that's the need to ensure that what we identify are those core elements that will require a generic response to a pandemic, and then the specific elements depending on what the pathogen is, how it's transmitted.
Okay, I'm just going to go back to early 2020, if I may.
Just before you do, I'm sorry to interrupt. So, Michael, you talked about the importance of the role of emergency planning and the gold, silver command structure. Isn't that separate from the pandemic influenza plan?
Sorry.
That's normal. So, if you have a normal emergency, that's your standard emergency planning.
No, I think that's a very valid point, Chair. I think that the point I was seeking to make is that in terms of pandemic flu planning and preparedness, most of the major exercises that we've deployed have tested those arrangements, our emergency planning arrangements. So every time, for instance, in 2016, I know we covered this in Module 1, Exercise Cygnus, we reviewed our emergency plan and developed it further. So I mean, they are absolutely discrete. One is generic, one is more specific. I think what I was seeking to make the point is that there is a link.
I understand that. The reason I ask is that I did hear evidence in Module 2 to the effect that the UK government certainly virtually abandoned the pandemic influenza plan because it really wasn't much use for the kind of pandemic we faced.
I think that I think you're correct. I think the approach that we're taking now is talking about planning for pandemic capabilities that are pathogen neutral. It may well be that within that we envisage different scenarios. I mean, we will always have to be prepared for a pandemic flu. It is and always has been on the highest level of the National Risk Register. But I think we need to take a broader, more holistic approach. Otherwise, we get caught out by something like coronavirus, which we were not expecting. And I think that's the point I was trying to make, that pandemic capabilities, and then consider certain scenarios in terms of how certain pathogens might emerge and how they might be transmitted.
Just going back to the specific planning, did the plan in Northern Ireland then become the 3rd of March plan, the United Kingdom-wide plan?
It was. I mean, I think that, shorter answer, yes.
Yes. And obviously the inquiry heard quite stringent criticism of that plan in Module 2, and for example it being referred to as resembling more a communications plan than any sort of substantive plan for a pandemic. Was that view shared in Northern Ireland?
No. I think that it was a reasonable plan, and I've had lots of experience with major incidents, and now I've lived through 2 pandemics. And all I would say, and again it's back to the point I made earlier, no plan in my experience survives the first engagement with a new virus or a new variant of a virus. And every time you have to change and modify and adapt, and that's, so we had the building blocks that were within the pandemic flu plan, but we significantly adopted those and changed those because every virus is different. And the response to the coronavirus was hugely different from anything that we'd envisaged with pandemic flu. So coming back to the coronavirus plan, I think it was a good plan in terms of its various elements, in terms of contain, delay, research and mitigate. I think it was, as you described and other witnesses have described, it was publicly accessible, and I think that was a real strength. I mean, it was readable. I think it explained in clear terms the government's response, UK government's response, and the devolved administrations. And I think, in general, we worked our way through that. And if we want to look back at what we did in the contain phase and mitigation phase, what we did in terms of research to inform our understanding of the virus, to develop new drugs and vaccines, and then the mitigation phase, I think we broadly follow the key elements of the plan. But as I say, there is no such thing as a plan that doesn't need changed and adapt. I mean, I remember saying at the time, in interviews, the virus doesn't have a plan and it doesn't read our plan, and it will be the same with the next pandemic. And that's why the really important elements is to be able to have that agility, as I've said in my statement, and the ability to rapidly adapt and innovate and change to whatever the emerging issues are.
Well, I'm going to come back and look at the information that you had at the start and the planning that took place in respect of the specific information, but I think we've probably come to our morning break.
Certainly. I shall return at 11:30. Stop.
Thank you. So, Michael, I just wanted to return then to the facts about information that was being provided to you in January 2020,
Okay.
if I may. And I wanted to start with the information that was provided by Professor Woolhouse in Scotland on the 25th of January 2020. And the inquiry has already heard about that. I can take you to that if you would like, but it's probably information, I imagine, that you recall, or an email that you recall, when he set out the concerns or set out the predictions about what, on the basis of the work Scotland had done, they thought might happen in terms of their health system, and set out the view or the concern that the Scottish health system would be completely overwhelmed. Do you recollect the email that I'm talking about? Yes.
I do, and it may or be helpful to pull it up. It did flag that point, but I think it also...
Would you like to see it? Yes,
No, well, it's there on the screen, and I think that what it also points to is the huge uncertainty that there was at that time, and the fact that it would take some time. If we look at the penultimate paragraph, there are some very good reasons to suppose it might not be as bad as that, but we need additional evidence not currently available, etc., etc. So I think that there was concern of the potential impact, but I think that there was very significant uncertainty at that stage. And that's
Sorry, forgive me, I didn't mean to cut across you, but if we look at the final paragraph in this email, it says it's still possible that this outbreak can be contained and that Scotland and the rest of the UK escapes relatively lightly, but I and others consider this more of a hope than an expectation at this stage. So that doesn't speak so much of uncertainty, does it?
Well, I mean, I think this has to be put in the context of that there was a range of scientific views at that time. And even if we fast forward, and I don't know whether, I think it was probably the SAGE meeting of the 28th of February, there was again discussion at that meeting about whether or not there was even established transmission in the UK, and or how likely that was. So I think that there were a range of scientific views at that time, and certainly this was one potential scenario, and it was a concerning scenario. But at least at that stage, there was still, this potential that the virus would be contained in early January within China. The other scenario was that it wouldn't be, and obviously then that would have wider consequences. I think the other point I would make is that if there was, as we were discussing at that time, the potential for spillover into the UK, that still at that stage did not mean that we would see sustained human-to-human transmission and an outbreak. And again, if I would give an example, we had, back in 2003, we had SARS, another coronavirus, with a high mortality, which caused a significant number of deaths in parts of the world where there were outbreaks, and then it disappeared. Why it disappeared, we don't know. So I think that all I would say is that I think it's very important when you're looking back at events that we avoid falling into you should have known because of what's happened subsequently. We knew what we knew at a point in time, and at that time there was still a high degree of uncertainty as to how this might develop, or indeed if it would develop.
All right, so if it would develop, we'll come on to examine that. But at this point in time, obviously there'd been a Cobra. This sort of information is coming from counterparts in Scotland. Where was your antennae in terms of potential concern, or, I mean, how worried, I suppose, were you by this point in time that this might, in fact, become something very serious?
It's hard now to reflect back with any degree of certainty. I had a high level of concern, I think as we all did at that stage. And I think we were proceeding on that precautionary principle that this may be very significant. Still at that time, it had the potential not to be so significant. And I think that, you know, planning and preparing in uncertainty is extremely difficult. I think that I do recall after the Cobra meeting on the 29th of January, I was concerned. I was very concerned. But then again, I suppose my responsibility and role is to look forward as to what might happen, and then to map my way back from there in terms of, well, and planning for a range of different scenarios, which I think is what we were doing at that time and in that period from January and into February.
In terms of the risk posed to Northern Ireland, it wasn't theoretical, was it, in terms of China being on the other side of the world? Because the inquiry has seen that on exactly the same day, there were tourists from Wuhan in China who entered Northern Ireland, and in fact, we've seen some messages about that.
Yes, and you know, I mean, I can't recall the exact detail at that stage. I mean, Wuhan had gone into lockdown. I can't recall the exact timing of when those tourists left Wuhan, but China was in no state at that time closing airports from Wuhan. I think that, you know, it's interesting now because I saw those WhatsApps, and it's interesting how others interpret your degree of concern or otherwise. There was an extensive exercise undertaken with those.
Can I just ask you to pause to ask why you say that? I think we've seen in one of those messages, and this may be what you're alluding to, the message said tourists from Wuhan were actually known to have arrived in Northern Ireland, nothing to stop them. CMO is not concerned. Is that what you were referring to? Yes,
which I think it is, you know, it shows, I think we're all now very familiar with the dangers of WhatsApps. But I think that that abbreviated version of events belies the significant risk assessment that was undertaken at that time. So this was a group of tourists who had travelled into England and had travelled through England, had travelled into Scotland, and then into Northern Ireland. Now, one of the party had developed respiratory symptoms, had presented and been tested in Scotland and had been confirmed as having flu, seasonal flu, had been tested negative for COVID, and all of the other travellers were asymptomatic. So they had been risk assessed in Scotland. They travelled into Northern Ireland. The time that we saw them, all were asymptomatic. Our public health agency made contact with them immediately on their arrival. Prior to the departure, I was in contact with the Chief Medical Officer in Scotland. I contacted the Chief Medical Officer in the Republic of Ireland to advise of their onward travel, and public health agencies in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland were in close liaison. So I think that to suggest that, and I think the WhatsApp summary sort of belies the significant amount of risk assessment and ongoing work that was undertaken at that time.
I'm not clear as to the risk assessment that took place in Northern Ireland, because I think as the inquiry understands the information, but because there was only one individual who had respiratory symptoms, there wasn't anything anyone could do, and the tourists were allowed to proceed into Northern Ireland. So, I mean, they weren't tested or anything, or... Well,
they had been tested in Scotland, and they were asymptomatic. And I think, let's bear in mind what our approach was at that particular time. So this was well in advance of some of the other measures that were taken across the UK in terms of people returning from China. So the risk assessment was carried out by experts in public health, both in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, and we passed on the relevant information to public health colleagues in the Republic of Ireland. So I think that I mean, from my professional assessment of the action that was carried out, the risk assessment that was made, the testing that was carried out, I was satisfied with those arrangements, as were the authorities in Scotland and the authorities in the Republic of Ireland.
Can I just check, were all of those individuals tested in Scotland?
I don't have that detail.
I thought that perhaps was what you were suggesting. I don't think we've seen any evidence.
I wasn't suggesting anything of that nature. There was one individual who was symptomatic who was tested. The others were not symptomatic. I suspect in that they were not symptomatic, they were not tested. But again, I don't have that detail.
So can you remind me, when was the date of this?
25th of January.
Right. I'm trying to remember when the first tests in Scotland started.
I don't have
No,
information
I'm not
about
surprised because you went
Scotland to
into
hand.
Abe. I was.
It was much later.
Yeah.
It was in February.
Yes.
I think there's a wider point, if it would.
So before you go on to the wider
Yeah.
point, if the tests in Scotland didn't start till February, how was a member of the tourist group tested in January?
Well, that's the information I have.
In Scotland?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there probably wasn't widespread testing. I mean, certainly we started testing in Northern Ireland, had the capacity to test from the 10th of February. In terms of at some scale. But again, I mean, that was the information that was relayed to us. So, I mean, I obviously cannot speak for the authorities in Scotland. I think, if I may, there's maybe a wider point which I think is maybe helpful here, which is that the measures that were subsequently introduced by the Chinese authorities and were introduced in terms of returning travellers from China, and then we expanded that to include travellers from other parts of the world, other parts of Asia, subsequently Italy. We now know, but didn't know at the time, that those measures were actually effective. The route of seeding of infection into the UK was not from China. It actually came from Europe and from European countries, from Italy, from Spain, from France. We didn't know that at the time, but we now know that from genomic sequencing. So
I am going to come on to Italy and some involvement you had, I think, in giving advice or certainly steering direction of travel in Northern Ireland about travel to Northern Italy. But if I may just take it chronologically, and then we can return to that, and then obviously you'll be able to provide evidence about that. But just coming back to this period of time, I mean, did you understand, Sir Michael, there to be a significant shift in understanding between the 22nd and the 24th of January in terms of transmission of COVID-19, in terms of human-to-human transmission being sustained?
Well, we certainly, again, I can't now recall the exact date, but certainly in that period, we certainly were able to confirm that there was human-to-human transmission. Now, there's a difference between human-to-human transmission and sustained human-to-human transmission. We certainly saw that there was human-to-human transmission within China, and we were around that period, I think, late January. I think that the WHO, I think, had confirmed that, and we had evidence which was consistent with that. However, back to the SARS example, we didn't yet know whether that human-to-human transmission would be sustained and therefore potentially could lead to a pandemic.
All right. The Imperial College report number 3, I think it reported on the 23rd of January, hadn't it? That human-to-human transmission was the only plausible explanation for the size of the outbreak. Is that correct?
But I think we're talking about two separate issues here. One is human-to-human transmission, which I absolutely accept there was evidence of. Sustained human-to-human transmission is quite another thing. You can get human-to-human transmission because of close proximity, but that depends on how infectious the agent is. So, for instance, if you're in very close proximity or you're living with someone who has the infection and very close contact, then you will see human-to-human transmission. However, that does not necessarily mean that you're going to see wider community transmission, particularly if the infectiousness of the virus is different in other environments. So, for instance, in more open spaces or in the environment more generally. So I think that there's a really, really important distinction there to be made, which is an important one.
All right, but in terms of, again, just coming back to the sort of antennae of concern at about this period in time, nonetheless, did that shift in understanding about human-to-human transmission, as it were, make you more concerned and more worried at this point?
I think it raised a level of concern, yes.
All right. And then I think that in terms of chronologically, what happened next or what might be relevant to you is, we've seen reference to this, and again I can bring it up if needs be. Professor Sir Chris Whitty's email of the 28th of January, where he essentially said that the way things might go was effectively binary. Either China would have a large outbreak but would contain it, or it would have a large outbreak and it wouldn't be able to contain it. And it appears from the email that he sent that that was the position he had arrived at, having discussed the position with the other UK CMOs. Is that correct?
That's correct. We had a call on the 24th of January where we discussed this, to the best of my memory.
All right. And again, can the inquiry presume then that was the basis upon which you were working as well, that it was
Yes.
a dichotomous position and that there wasn't, as it were, any middle ground or fudge, so to speak?
It would have been unwise to assume there was some middle ground.
And in terms of your state of understanding or knowledge, again, at around this time, perhaps if we could bring this up, this is INQ 000282744. And I think it's on page 2, please. Thank you. So I believe that this is the WhatsApp group for the UK CMOs.
That's correct, yes.
And I think it appears from this that on the 28th of January, you were setting out to your peers or to your counterparts that having considered the EWRS notification as reported appears to be consistent with asymptomatic transmission during the incubation period. Correct?
Well, it's correct that that's my WhatsApp, yes.
Yes,
I'm
but
happy to elaborate on my thinking if that's the question. But
well, it was about your thinking, yes.
okay. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, the important thing in all of this is to have a precautionary approach. And you mentioned about antennae, and we were very alert to this was a new virus about which we knew absolutely nothing at that point in time. And it was therefore important that we kept an open mind about the potential consequences. And you mentioned that dichotomous position, so that was our view. But also what we were very alert to was the transmission dynamics. How infectious was this virus? Were we going to see sustained human-to-human transmission? To what extent would we see that? Had it the potential to become a pandemic, or was it going to be like the SARS outbreak in 2003, where we didn't see sustained human-to-human transmission and the virus disappeared? I mean, this, as I recall receiving this report, and this was related to a cluster of cases in Germany at the time, and as I recall, related to someone who had returned from China. And we had incomplete details, and I simply was raising a question. And obviously, I think quite correctly, Professor Sir Chris Whitty was, agreeing that it raised the question, but not conclusive, and we really needed to await the nerve tag assessment.
Well, I think the next message down, I'm not sure if we're able to go to it, maybe on the next page, yes. So whoever the owner of the cell phone is, and I'm afraid I don't know that, says, but we should now assume that it's happening, or may be happening. I
think that is Professor Sir Chris Whitty's response to me.
All right. So we should assume it may be happening.
I think that, from and I think this is another important point. In January and February, we were alert to the possibility, and that was as far as, and it was important that we were alert to that possibility. We didn't know. There was no evidence to suggest it. We were actively seeking to understand whether there was asymptomatic transmission or not, but what we needed was evidence. And as I recall, it wasn't even till probably towards the end of March, and I do recall a readout from a nerve tag meeting on about the 15th of May when we actually had definitive evidence of asymptomatic infection. So had we known what we now know, then things may have been very different. But we did not know then, and we did not have the evidence, but we were alert to that possibility in January and February, and it was right that we asked the question.
May I ask you a number of points about that? First of all, you said in your reply that we should take, or that there had to be a precautionary approach.
Yeah.
And I wasn't clear as to what you meant by precautionary in that context.
It wasn't in relation to this. I don't think I was talking about a precautionary approach in terms of planning and preparing for what might happen in relation to the potential or otherwise for a pandemic.
So do you mean precautionary in the sense of the worst might happen,
yes,
plan on that basis, as opposed to the opposite to that, which is precautionary? We don't know how this is going to play out, so let's not plan too definitively, or...
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that, there was no, sitting and waiting was not an option here. We had to plan and prepare for what potentially might happen. I mean, it would have been irresponsible to sit and wait to see how things pan out. And therefore, what we started to do then was gear up for what potentially might happen, even though we didn't know, we weren't certain at that stage how things might develop. Now, I mean, it's always difficult when you look back at, at what point were you clearer? What point were you more certain? I think we proceeded on the basis of what might happen, because if you wait and waited until it actually happened, it would be too late.
Yes, well,
to do any preparation.
But I think just coming back to your point that there wasn't evidence of asymptomatic transmission until the end of March, the final message here is that you should proceed on the assumption that it may be happening, correct?
Well, I mean, again, we proceed on the basis of the expert advice from Nerve Tag and SAGE. I mean, this is an informal WhatsApp chat between chief medical officers. What would happen, and what did happen, is all of that information in relation to that particular case would have been considered by UK leading experts in terms of, do we have evidence here of asymptomatic infection? I would defer to those who are more expert than I in this area, and to the scientific experts within Nerve Tag who are examining that. And at all stages, as UK CMOs, we were informed by the considered views of Nerve Tag, which fed into SAGE. So I'm raising a question which I think needs to be asked. The answer to that question, I don't then know.
Well, the answer from Sir Chris Whitty does appear to be clear, but can I ask...
No, okay, sorry, I really don't accept that characterisation. I mean, I think what he's saying, compatible, probable, but not conclusive, and then goes on, Nerve Tag, So, I mean, I think what that is essentially saying is Nerve Tag need to consider this. So, I think I wouldn't, maybe I'm dancing on the head of a pin here, but I think that it is an important distinction to make. There was no certainty at that point. I posed the question, and it was right and proper that Nerve Tag looked and formed a considered view based on scientific evidence.
I'm certainly not trying to engage in a semantic argument.
No.
I just read his last message as making a very different point to the one he was making in the message above, which is that notwithstanding the uncertainty, nonetheless, you should proceed on the basis that it may be happening. In other words, you should plan, you should...
Well, I mean, I think there's a distinction there. I mean, I think that, again, what we needed to do was ascertain whether that was the case. I mean, there is a very different response required for planning for and responding to a pandemic, which is asymptomatic transmission. So, for instance, the critical important to know is how much asymptomatic transmission there is. Is asymptomatic transmission as great a risk as symptomatic transmission? So why that's relevant is if you ask, as we did on the 12th of March, everyone with symptoms to self-isolate, if there are asymptomatic individuals, is the power of transmission sufficient to maintain transmission in the community? So it's a really, really important point, and it has major implications. At this point in time, we did not know, we didn't have the evidence, but I think we were asking the right question as to whether or not there was or there wasn't. But it would have been at that stage premature to assume until we had the evidence to suggest. I mean, why this was at the back of our minds is that we did know that asymptomatic transmission can occur with other coronaviruses. We know, for instance, with SARS, that infection and symptoms largely coincide. So most people who had SARS really became infectious to others with the onset of the symptoms when they were coughing and sneezing. But we knew that there was a possibility slightly before that, but perhaps within 24 hours. We didn't know with this particular virus because, whilst there was an 80% similarity between this virus and SARS, they weren't the same viruses. And the problem with all of this is that we just didn't understand the basic science about this virus, its transmissibility, how infectious it was, whether there was asymptomatic infection or not, and we were planning in huge uncertainty. And looking back now with all we know about this virus, I think it's important that we bear in mind throughout that we knew so little then. Our planning was based on what we knew about other coronaviruses because we didn't have the scientific data about this particular virus.
Can I just cut through and ask, what would have been wrong or what would the problem have been, assuming you didn't work on the assumption that asymptomatic transmission might be happening? What was the difficulty in proceeding on that basis in your planning?
I think the approach that the approach that we take, and I think is the right approach, was to be informed by the evidence and the science and all of this. At this stage there was a high level of uncertainty, and I think it would have been not appropriate to proceed on the basis of what we think. And at all times, the advice that I provided, was informed by the best scientific advice that was available to me. And at this point in time, nerve tag sage, we're not saying that there is asymptomatic transmission. But we were alert to the fact that we needed to keep this under review and see if there was or there wasn't.
Okay, I'll come back to perhaps when one starts to plan on the basis of the imperfect picture, but just going back to the chronology, it seems clear that it was well understood within government in Northern Ireland from around the 5th of February, and when I say government, it appears that civil servants who were not in the Department of Health understood from the 5th of February that the United Kingdom government's position was that China had lost control of the pandemic. So in other words, that in terms of the dichotomous position set out by Sir Chris Whitty, the direction of travel was towards the worst case scenario that he had set out in his email, correct?
I think that's the correct timescale without looking at the record, yes.
All right. And in terms of then what happened in Northern Ireland after that point in time, what was, and I suppose the premise of the question is, again, this must have raised the alert and the concern even more. What was the strategic response to that you advised?
Well, our strategic response had kicked in much earlier on the basis of my advice. So we had already at that stage stood up our operational response arrangements, referred to as Silver, which is the Public Health Agency, Health and Social Care Board. In the department, we had stood up our Gold Health arrangements, which is on the 27th of January. There were daily calls between Health, Silver and Gold, so we were processing emerging information that was coming from UK government, and we were relaying that information was coming in to us. And certainly from early February, there was a lot of planning going on at that stage. In early February, there were daily four-nation calls at departmental level. There were daily calls between what was then Public Health England and the public health bodies in the other nations, including the Public Health Agency. The Public Health Agency was, even in that first week in February, was developing plans for dealing with our first potential case. We were dealing with protocols and we may come on to this, about the transfer of patients either to a high consequence infectious disease unit in England or to the regional infectious disease unit in Belfast. We were developing guidance for general practice. We were engaging in relation to communicating out to health professionals about what the potential symptoms might do, and there's a number of circulars to that effect. Providing advice about returning travellers, and that changed very frequently as more and more countries were beginning to identify cases, advising those individuals returning to self-isolate. We were ramping up testing capacity in our regional virus laboratory, so we were, on the 10th of January, we had, at that stage, knew what the genetic makeup of the virus was, and on the 10th of February we were one of 12 centres across the UK who began testing for Covid-19, although we only had 40 tests a day capacity. We were developing and working at pace to develop legislation in terms of the Coronavirus Act. We were working with the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, and developing all of those clauses. We also were developing legislation to make COVID a notifiable disease so that we could track cases in the community as they arose. Similarly, the colleagues in the PHA were ramping up their health protection capacity to deal with any potential outbreaks, including looking at their arrangements for contact tracing. I met with colleagues in the Health and Social Care Board on the 11th of February and asked them to develop surge plans for health and social care, and follow that up in a letter on the 17th of February. So there were many, many other things we were doing in terms of also the Minister was briefing the executive, having attended Cobra, and he did so on the 3rd, the 10th, the 17th and 24th of February. We were briefing senior officials across all government departments, up to and including the head of the civil service, in terms of what might lay ahead and the impact across government. So what we were doing in health was getting ready and flagging to others, you need to get ready, this could be potentially a very significant problem. But and again, that's just a snapshot of some of the activity at that time and doesn't reflect the totality of it.
No, and I'm going to, if I may, just examine some of the aspects of that. I wanted, though, first of all, to just pick up and ask, and obviously it's appreciated that you were the Chief Medical Officer within the Department of Health, but in terms of flagging to broader government in Northern Ireland at that time how potentially serious the position had become, what was the channel by which that was being communicated by you or by the Department of Health? Or what was the principal channel by which that was being communicated?
Well, I mean, at that stage, as you pointed out, Cobra meetings had been occurring. The minister had been nominated by the executive office to represent the Northern Ireland Executive at the Cobra meetings. I supported the minister at those meetings. Executive office officials attended those meetings. The executive office was receiving papers, Cobra ministerial meeting papers, and also was attending Cobra official meetings from early February. So they were receiving all of the information themselves. In addition to that,
I think the question was, sorry to interrupt, I think the question you may have misunderstood was, how did you pass it on? What was the main channel for passing it on?
Well, yeah,
Yes,
yeah. I
and
mean,
what
I think what I was trying to make the point is that the information was coming directly into the executive office, but in addition to that, what we were doing was we requested a meeting of CCG and I, the Civil Contingencies Group. We presented at that the emerging picture of one of my Deputy Chief Medical Officers.
That came much later, didn't it? That was on the 20th of February.
That was on the 20th of February.
Yeah.
And
I'm really just focusing on, I'm taking this chronologically, trying to understand what alarm bells were being sounded by you, if any, to wider government in Northern Ireland about quite how serious the position was, given the centrality of your role and the information being provided to you by dint of, for example, you being in the UK-wide CMO group. And
yeah, well, as I say, the information was going in directly into the executive office, and officials were attending the relevant meetings. In addition to that, back in, as I recall, the Cobra meeting of the 5th of February, there was an action that all departments across governments, including the DAs, should consider their business continuity arrangements and planning for a reasonable worst-case scenario for flu. The then head of population health flagged that in a written memo to the head of the TEO. And I mean, I think you did look at this previously, but I think it's important that.
Are you talking about the 6th of February communication?
Yes.
I'm going to come to that. I'm taking this in stages.
Okay.
So I'll go to some of what happened before that, and I'll go to some of the correspondence around it, and then you'll have an opportunity to address it.
Well, all I would say is, things were moving very quickly at that point in time, and there was a pace and momentum, and there certainly, if you look back on this, and I think it's important that we do look back on this, that at this time we had raised the UK CMOs on the basis of the emerging picture. So let's go back a little bit and look at that earlier period. On the 30th of 30th of January, the World Health Organization said this is a public health emerging and international concern. As UK CMOs, we met and agreed to raise the alert level to moderate. Now, we did so to send a signal to all of government and all governments to begin to plan and prepare, and that means, all eventualities. I appreciate that to the layperson, moderate sounds pretty benign, but I think those of us who are familiar with that terminology, moderate means prepare for all eventualities, and preparing for all eventualities meant, using the reasonable worst case scenario for pandemic flu without a vaccine.
Well, I think maybe if we just look then at some of the specific communications at around this time to try and understand that. And if I could start, please, with INQ 000 201 813, and page 1, please. I think the inquiry has seen this already. It's an email from a Miss Rooney to Mr. Stewart, so individuals within the TEO. So this is following that Cobra meeting at the end of January. We can see that the Minister Swan, asked if the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister had been briefed on the issue, and we assume that's the evidence that was coming to light about COVID-19. And we can see there, she says, I haven't seen any papers going through, so I'm not clear on what the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have been informed to date. It's anticipated it will become a global pandemic over the next 3 weeks. Agreed, and it would appear that Ms Rooney's reporting back what had been agreed at the meeting. It would be prudent to move to planning for a reasonable worst. It says VAS, but I assume that means case scenario. Possible that it will be similar to the flu pandemic experience of 2018. I'm going to come to the next chain in this, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about it. And I think we can see that the reply given from Mr. Stewart at the start, that's a stark assessment, and we should brief First Minister and Deputy First Minister. Please seek input from the Department of Health. And then if we go, please, to the next document, which is INQ 000 469 468, and page 1, please. It appears that, and this is, sorry, I should say, an email from you to Miss Rooney, saying, Bernie, please confirm this paper has been updated as per my email today. Given the professional and technical nature of these papers, as CMO, I will wish to clear all future executive papers while DOH remains the lead government department. So just pausing there. So Michael, this was officials from the executive office who were, it would appear, simply seeking to update the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister about the outcome of Cobra. I won't go back to the notes of the 24th of January, but the 29th of January, but like the Cobras before, it was attended, wasn't it, by a wide range of ministers from across government.
That's correct.
In Northern Ireland, in the United Kingdom. So not just a meeting of health officials or health ministers. And looking at that email and the language you use, you as CMO are saying that you want to clear executive papers. So, I mean, on the face of it, not medical advice going to the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, but clearing papers from within their own department, updating them about Cobra meetings. Can you explain, sorry, forgive me for cutting across you, that might be thought or might appear to the outside eye to be a clear example of overreach into the executive office on your part?
I mean, I accept the interpretation that you've placed upon it, but I think the qualification is professional and technical. What I was referring to is that any professional advice or technical advice into the paper, absolutely, I would have expected to have cleared that, given the significance and importance of that. I mean, I think it's one thing, someone sitting in a room, and maybe we'll come back to the first email as you've suggested. One thing, someone sitting in a room forming an interpretation of what they've heard, particularly if an individual doesn't have a professional or technical background, and then providing an interpretation of that. In something of such nature and importance, I absolutely felt it was important that in terms of that professional input into the paper, irrespective of what else it said, that I needed to be cited on that and needed to agree that. I accept as it's written there, you know, your interpretation is another interpretation, but that's not what's meant by that.
I don't think it's a question of interpretation. I mean, I think it's a question of you as CMO inserting yourself into the processes of the executive office so that the officials couldn't provide an update without, as you saying, wishing to clear. And it's not just this, clearing all future executive papers whilst the Department of Health remains the lead government department.
Well,
no, and sorry, forgive me, the executive was a separate department to yours.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the point I'm making is that at this point in time, we were clearly the lead government department. This was professional technical advice to which I was referring, and I think it was entirely appropriate that I was assured of the completeness of professional and technical advice to the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. What I was referring to was, and again, I appreciate it's not well worded, but I was referring to clearing the advice that we were providing. As I recall, and subsequently found out, the advice had actually been provided by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, so there wasn't an issue. But I wasn't aware of that at the time. Such was the pace of events. But certainly that's what I intended by that email, and certainly, I stand by it that I absolutely needed to clear professional and technical advice to inform any executive papers the First Minister and Deputy First Minister.
It says I wish to clear all future executive papers while the Department of Health remains the lead government department. It doesn't say I wish to clear. I mean, you wouldn't need to say I wish to clear my own advice, because you would be providing it.
But look, let's be clear. I do not, never have done clear executive papers, and the officials in TEO would know that. It's badly framed and worded there, except. But I have no role. Role in clearing executive papers. Those are considered and approved by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. And as you saw throughout the pandemic, our role was simply, my role was to provide professional and technical advice into those papers. That's what I meant by it. I appreciate there could be a different interpretation put on it, but that is not a correct interpretation.
Well, I mean, the impression that's given is, I think, again, the centrality perhaps of your role, and that, as I've said, even within the executive office, officials don't seem to have been able to simply provide papers about Cobra, for example, without you having sight, and I mean, it says in terms clearing them.
I could make this point again, and we can, but what I was, I'm certain in my own mind, I remember sending this email, I was simply referring to professional and technical matters. I needed to be cited on those. I became aware a paper had gone. I didn't know what and who had contributed to or cleared the professional and technical input into it. I subsequently found out that it had been provided by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. At that time, I didn't know. I knew a paper had gone, and I was concerned that it perhaps didn't fully reflect the concerns at that time and the risks at that time. I think I would have been in dereliction of my responsibilities as Chief Medical Officer were I not to assure myself of the accuracy of the information that was been provided on the professional and technical aspects of that. I have no role in clearing executive papers, none, and never have had, and did not have throughout the pandemic, and that would have been understood. I understood that, and officials in TEO would have understood that.
I'm going to bookmark the lead department and come back to that in a second, but perhaps just to deal with that shortly, there wasn't any doubt, was there, or uncertainty, that the Department of Health was the lead department for the purposes of this emergency?
At that stage, yes.
Right. We'll come back and I will take you to the protocol, the 2016 protocol about that.
Can we come, you mentioned earlier we'd come back to the email of the 29th, which we didn't do.
We can certainly do that. Was there a point that you wanted to make about it?
Which I think is an important point.
I think it's INQ 000 201 813.
I think it's,
yes, Sir Michael,
it's before that. I think it's just over the page, the earlier page, if I might please. Okay, and I think this makes the point helpfully the third line down. It is anticipated that this will become a global pandemic over the next 3 weeks. That wasn't what was said at the Cobra meeting. I was at that Cobra meeting. The update was provided by Professor Sir Chris Whitty, and the minutes will reflect what he said, which he said this has, I paraphrase it, and he was referring to the fact that this would be either contained within China or not. But we won't know that for the next 3 weeks. So the reference here that this will become a global pandemic over the next 3 weeks is an interpretation of what an individual without professional or technical background made of that. Now, that's not a criticism, it's just a statement of fact. So I think that if we link that then back to the email we've just discussed, what was crucially important in my mind was that I was confident of the advice, that professional technical advice that was provided to ministers on what we then knew about the pandemic and the potential risks.
Well, Ms Rooney was someone who was involved in civil contingencies, so she did have a distinct role within that sphere, within the executive office. So one might have thought that she would be entitled to brief ministers or to provide that information, or at least if this was an issue of real concern to her, that she would be able to communicate that.
No, it's not that. That is not. That's not. But sorry, that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that reflects a less than full understanding of what was discussed at that Cobra meeting. It's absolutely not a criticism whatsoever.
Well,
It's just a statement of fact.
Yes, I think what that would suggest was that the officials were alarmed by what they had heard at the Cobra meeting and wanted to brief ministers to that effect.
Which was entirely appropriate, and which is why the health minister asked if the First Minister and Deputy First Minister had been briefed.
So just moving on then to, as you've referred to before, the Cobra meeting on the 5th of February that had some officials from the TEO at it. I won't bring up the notes. I don't think we need to, because I think you know this, you've referred to it. That Cobra on the 5th of February agreed that all departments to rapidly advance planning for reasonable worst-case scenario, centrally coordinated by Civil Contingencies Secretariat, correct?
Correct.
And I think, or you may tell me this is not the case, but is that what prompted the letter from Liz Redmond of the Department of Health on the 6th of February?
I can't be certain, and I'm conscious what I'm doing is piecing information almost together, but I think in terms of the timeline, I think that's most likely the case. I think so, because I think if we look at correspondence from you at the same time, it demonstrates this. Yes. And perhaps if we could just look briefly at that letter. It's INQ 000218471, and it's page 2. So again, and I'm just drawing attention to this. So, sorry, I was going to look at the second paragraph very briefly because, again, it obviously makes the point that health is the lead government department. Yeah. So, again, no lack of clarity about that. And then if we may just go down a couple of paragraphs, please, and we see, and we've seen this a number of times. Sir Michael, the advice that appears to be given, I do not consider it necessary to activate NICMA arrangements at this time unless and until the infection appears in Northern Ireland and impacts are experienced here. Was that advice that you had provided or that you were party to at this point in time? With the passage of time, I don't have a clear recollection of that being discussed with me, although I would say, given where we were at that point in time, I felt that was not an unreasonable position, and I wouldn't have disagreed with that. Even, well, at the time, I wouldn't have disagreed with that assessment where we were at that point in time.
I mean, that might seem a surprising answer. I mean, given that it's advice that you don't need to activate civil contingencies until the virus is actually a reality in Northern Ireland. So it seems to obviate the fact that contingency arrangements might play a vital part in planning for that.
I'm happy to elaborate on that, but I think that it wasn't. What it wasn't saying was, don't do anything. I think we moved down a little bit. Sorry, no, it was on that paragraph. Apologies. Yeah. So, in order to provide assurances, should an escalation of events be required, a request to implement NICMA, it would be helpful if you would consider convening a multi-agency meeting in order to inform an assessment of sectoral resilience, preparedness, capacity and capabilities across Northern Ireland departments, agencies and emergency service. So I think what we were signalling there is the department's assessment at this time is not just yet, but you need to get ready. You need to prepare, and I think that also, and we may, I hope I'm not jumping ahead, we may come on to this, the update that was provided by the PermSec then to the PermSec group, where he said this is a very fluid situation, a rapidly evolving situation, and urging PermSec colleagues to consider their business continuity plans and to plan on the basis of pandemic flu, reasonable worst-case scenario. So I think we were clearly signalling there is a problem coming our way, and we need to prepare for it. Not just health, but other departments need to prepare for this.
The suggestion, it would be helpful if you would consider convening a multi-agency meeting, hardly sounds alarm bells, does it? I mean, it's...
Well, I mean, it's how civil servants write to each other. I agree. We would not be putting in writing a memo to the lead official in TEO, and then this also included a letter from myself. I don't send many letters to departments saying you need to plan and prepare on the basis of reasonable case worst scenario for pandemic flu to check preparedness and readiness. So, I mean, for those who know, we were clearly signalling that there is a problem, a potential problem here, and we need to be assured of our preparedness and our readiness across government and sector resilience across Northern Ireland. So I appreciate the wording, but I would say to you, the interpretation of that and what we were doing would be clearly understood by those who needed to understand.
So you mean that the officials in the TEO to whom this was addressed, who aren't medical professionals, would understand from this that actually what you were saying was the situation is incredibly serious and all departments in Northern Ireland really need to start thinking about the fact that there's a global pandemic.
There is
on the way.
There is a potential. I mean, because don't forget at this stage, the global pandemic wasn't declared by WHO until the 11th of March. So we're in very, very early weeks here. The point you made there in terms of not professional or technical staff, it's back to the earlier point that you made. They were still individuals who were in civil contingencies branch and therefore would have been familiar with the language and the request and what we were asking for. So it didn't require a professional or technical background to understand this request. This request wasn't being made by me in a professional technical capacity. It was basically being made in relation to being prepared to stand up our civil contingency arrangements.
So, Michael, could I just ask you to use hindsight for a minute? And I appreciate the number of people in your position who don't want me to use hindsight. But using plain English, wouldn't it be better if that had said, we urge you as a matter of urgency to convene a multi-agency meeting, as opposed to it would be helpful if? Wouldn't that have got across a sense of urgency?
the benefit of hindsight, it's a wonderful thing. I didn't write the letter. I accept the point that you're making. I think and I know we're taking this chronologically, but certainly I used that language at a meeting of the Perm 6, which I attended on the 20th of February, but I appreciate that's a later time period. I think that it's the language that we use within government. I do accept your point that it could have been more direct, it could have been more action-orientated, but again, it comes back to the point that in health, perhaps it was unduly differential. I think it's the point you're making, and perhaps it may have been more helpful to have said, we now advise that you should.
See, I find it difficult to accept that in a time of emergency you would use that language just because that's the way you normally do things. In an emergency, you don't do things in a normal way. You get on with it. And I'm afraid that language doesn't give any sense of urgency.
As I say, I wasn't the author of the letter, but I do accept the point that you're making. But I think if we put it in the context of the attendance of TEO officials at Cobra meetings, it wasn't that this letter was coming completely out of any other context. At that stage, TEO officials were attending Cobra meetings. They were attending Cobra O meetings, official Cobra meetings. So the letter came in a context where there was already a knowledge within TEO of the wider aspects, and we alluded to earlier the email from exchange in TEO between officials about their level of concern. So I think that contextual point is important, but I accept the point you're making about the use of language.
Thank you.
Could I move on to the letter that you did send that day and which is annexed to this letter? And that's at INQ 000 218 470. Oh, sorry, forgive me. That was that letter. It's INQ 000 25 4430. So, first of all, Sir Michael, we can see that if we look in the left-hand corner of the top of this letter, that this was being sent to all Northern Ireland departments through the Civil Contingencies Group for onward distribution to all public authorities. And if we could please just scan, I don't want to take this out of context, Sir Michael, but we can see that you've explained, first of all, at paragraph 1, what the purpose of the letter is.
Yeah.
To respond to any and all potential eventualities. Maybe I'll come back to that language, but just to put this in context, it's essential that all departments are assured that proportionate, appropriate and efficient arrangements are in place that are consistent with key public health messages about novel coronavirus. Thank you. And if we just scroll down a bit, there's an explanation about coronavirus. There's reference at paragraph 4 to the symptoms. Paragraph 5. There's explanation that the cases have originated in Wuhan, and information about flights being suspended and so forth. I don't think it mentions anything about people potentially coming by bus or anything like that into Northern Ireland. I think the focus there is on flights from other airports. I say that because it specifically draws out the fact that there are no direct flights between China and Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland. And if we could scroll down, please, a little bit more. Then the key public health advice that you suggested there ought to be consistency with. We can see that it's about travel from Wuhan. We see that at 7. And paragraph 9. Thank you. And I think paragraph 9 says the same thing. And then paragraph 12 follows up on that. It's about travel from Wuhan. And if we could go down, please. And I think if we could go to paragraph 20. Sorry, I don't want to, again, take this out of context, but I think the paragraphs 13 to 17 are about travel advice. And then when we get to paragraph 20, there's reference to the fact that the Department of Health and other departments had received queries from a range of public authorities and other sources about what action they should take in response to the 2019 outbreak. And then the Department of Health is closely monitoring the outbreak as it develops. And the advice that's given is those public authorities that already have contingency plans for responding to infectious diseases, such as pandemic influenza, should ensure that all relevant staff are acquainted with those plans. I just want to check, please, there's nothing more. Yes, so paragraph 21, no other action is recommended at this time to public authorities in general. Again, Sir Michael, it might be thought that that's hardly sounding alarm bells for either Northern Ireland government departments or to all of the public authorities that they sponsored.
I mean, I think it's important to put this in context, and if we go back to the last letter, it was to facilitate and to enable a meeting where other cross-sectoral stakeholders were fully briefed and informed of the emerging threat. And I think if we link it back, and I know we haven't got it up on screen, but one of the action points arising out of the 5th of February SAGE was that, and I can't recall the exact wording, but that trusted partners would be informed of the emerging situation, and there was a communication strategy in relation to how that communication would be relayed. So all of this was doing was scene setting for a meeting at which there would be a briefing in relation to trusted partners, as was referred to in the Cobra meeting of the 5th of February, and that at that meeting assurances should be sought around contingency planning across the public sector and other organisations. So this letter was not meant or intended to explain or set out the level of risk or the level of concern. It was an enabler to facilitate a meeting which had been suggested, which we've just covered, at which there would be an update provided.
You're going to have to help me, because above paragraph 20 it says coronavirus actions to be taken by public authorities. It doesn't say anything about we're going to have a meeting and it's going to. I mean, it is what it says.
No, I mean, can we go back to the last exhibit, which was the letter from Liz Redmond, because I think it clearly states in that, or if it doesn't state in the letter, it states in the covering email which was associated with this, that went, to assist in the this cross-sectoral meeting, I attach a letter from the Chief Medical Officer. Maybe if we could go down the next page. Yeah. Penultimate paragraph. To assist with the wider government coordination here, the Chief Medical Officer has written a letter regarding health advice to be shared. I'd be grateful if you could arrange for this to be shared as soon as possible. So this was basically in the context of the meeting. And that was the purpose, as I recall, of the letter, and to ensure that those who attended were aware of the seriousness of the situation, in that as Chief Medical Officer I was writing a letter, and that they would be briefed at the meeting.
The letter, sorry, not this letter, the one that you sent, was to all Northern Ireland government departments and all public authorities.
No.
That they, I think.
No, it wasn't. The letter was attached to this memo, and it was distributed, and it was attached to this to go to TEO to distribute to all government departments, because we were doing this under the context of civil contingencies.
Sorry, forgive me.
That is a distinction, and I think it's an important distinction.
Sorry, I'd like to understand the distinction. So it's to all Northern Ireland departments through the Civil Contingencies Group for onward distribution to all public authorities.
Yeah.
So this letter was to, you intended that this would go to all public authorities in Northern Ireland, correct?
In the context of the civil contingencies arrangement. So I mean, there's 2 points to that. First is we were clearly signalling the importance and significance of this because we were rooting it and framing it in the civil contingency arrangements, which obviously you stand up if there's a level 2 or level 3 incident. And therefore we were sending it out in that context. And we were sending out in the context of the Executive Office responsibility for assurance around cross-sectoral preparedness and resilience, for which they are responsible. So, you know, as I recall, this email memo to the Executive Office had as an attachment this letter. The context was to have the meeting, and this was to inform stakeholders in advance of that briefing session. I mean, that's my clear recollection of the sequence of events at the time.
So in terms of the briefing session that you're referring to, I just want to be clear who that briefing, what this was a meeting of. Are you referring to the Civil Contingencies Group, or is that something else?
No, I mean, I think, you know, again, at this stage, I had many and multiple demands on my time, so I assume, I mean, I don't know, and you know, in terms of what action that TEO took on the back of it. There certainly was a CCG-NI meeting, and I suspect that CCG-NI meeting was probably on foot of this correspondence.
Okay, we'll come back to that meeting because we do have the minutes of what was discussed at it. But we know, and I won't take you to it, but the advice that was given by Liz Redmond about not considering it necessary to stand up NICMA, we know that advice was repeated by, well, certainly it was in his script or his speaking note, Richard Pengelly at a meeting of permanent secretaries the next day. It also appears that it was the message that was being provided, I think, to ministers at the same time. Is that right?
I mean, I wasn't at the executive meetings and certainly didn't attend regularly until around the 14th of May, although I did attend an early executive meeting on the 2nd of March. But as I said earlier, throughout February, there were regular weekly updates to the executive about the emerging situation. And the Minister, I know, and certainly in his speaking note, I can't vouch for the discussion at the executive meeting, but I know at the meeting of the 10th of February, he alluded to the fact that correspondence had been issued from the department to Civil Contingencies branch in relation to assurance around cross-sectoral preparedness and readiness. So, I mean, that was certainly in the Minister's briefing, but as I say, I wasn't in attendance at the executive meeting.
Maybe we could look at that. It's INQ 000 425517, please.
I hope I have the right date, but I can't be certain. Sorry.
Okay, check and see. This is...
That's the 14th, sorry.
That's the 14th of February, so it's a little bit after this. It's really just to understand the consistency of messaging. Have you got that?
I think it's INQ 000425551.
Sorry, we might be at cross purposes from each other.
Apologies.
I can. So I think, is this the document that you were referring to?
No, I think it's the 10th of February from memory, but you know, I stand to be corrected. I don't.
All right.
Can't be certain.
If I could go back, please, to the document.
The meeting was the 10th of February.
Yes.
Even though
That's a point. It could be less. Sorry, Chair,
Yeah.
you might be absolutely correct. Sorry, apologies.
that's right.
Oh, sorry, you are right. Apologies. Yes.
So we've got that.
I've got there, but it's not, in fact, the document I was
no.
going to. So,
Sorry.
I don't know if I'm confusing everyone. I didn't intend to.
You're not, Mr. Owen, and I shouldn't have tried to help.
No.
I think you were asking me about what the understanding of the executive was, and I was simply referring to the fact that the Minister had briefed the executive in relation to this communication to TEO and the letter from myself, and that's only the point I was trying to make, which is reflected in the briefing note here.
I was making a slightly different point, which was about the message that was being conveyed to ministers, but perhaps that means that it's a good point at which to break for lunch, and then I won't confuse anyone anymore.
Not at all. I shall return at 1:45.